Hello, my name is Alan On, Director of Programs and Communications for the Global America Business Institute, or GABI. Thank you for listening to this podcast on global nuclear energy, hosted and produced by GABI. I have the great privilege and honor of speaking with Mr. Paul Murphy. He's Managing Director in Gowling's WLG's Energy Group. He focuses on various aspects of the nuclear energy industry, ranging from regulatory issues and liability. He's widely recognized as an expert in the development and finance of nuclear power projects by the IAEA, NEA, the U.S. government. Paul, thanks for taking time to speak with me today. Just to start things off, could you talk a bit more about your recent work, not only at Gowling WLG, but also before?
Sure. First of all, Alan, thank you, and thank you to Gabby for having me participate in this discussion.
Our pleasure.
In terms of my work and the firm's work, Gowling WLG is a global law firm. We have 18 offices in 10 countries. We're over 1,400 lawyers. All elements of practice, but one of those is a very specialized focus in the nuclear sector, where we represent governments, vendors, lenders, contractors, and we cover all aspects from financing to contracting and project development to regulatory matters, intellectual property, and everything in between. In terms of some of the things that we've worked on and what I've worked on previously, I worked with the lenders, representing the lenders on the Baraka project in the UAE. More recently with Gowlings, we've been working on the Sinop project in Turkey, representing the project company and all the issues related to the development of that project. We've worked with Rosatom on the El Daba project in Egypt, and a number of other projects throughout the world, whether it be in Canada, the United States, the UK, in Asia, in the Middle East, and most recently in Argentina for Nuclear Electric Argentina on what now it seems to be a stalled project in terms of Atucha 3 and the next project in Argentina. We also do a lot of work with small modular reactors and helping developers and also countries think about how SMRs fit into the future of nuclear energy.
Okay, and we'll broach that topic a bit later. On this topic of nuclear power plant finance, there's certainly the widespread perception that nuclear is expensive in absolute terms, in terms of capital costs. The amounts needed for nuclear new build projects is certainly large in comparison to other energy technologies. What are the challenges unique to nuclear construction, and what is the role of financing in determining the ultimate viability of a nuclear project?
Sure. I think getting to the last part first,
Okay.
Financing is where the rubber hits the road in terms of whether the project goes forward, because you can have all the support for a nuclear project, all the need, the best ideas, the best technology, but if you can't finance it, there is no project.
Yeah.
And so it's very important in terms of the program planning and project planning, to think about issues related to financing from the very, very early days, because you always have to think about what are my sources, how can I structure it to get that financing. And we find, especially during that project development construction period, that there's a very limited source of financing. And what we're really seeing right now are government-to-government deals or export credit agency-driven deals as the two primary ways. And then, sort of what EDF is doing in the UK, where they're owning and functioning in that utility role, and then they have effectively an offtake agreement with the UK government. Oversimplifying of course, but through that contract for difference scheme, which is kind of a third way that I think people are looking at. But getting to the challenges, just because the project's big doesn't make it unique in terms of nuclear, because we see in the oil and gas industry a lot of mega projects, and we see that mega projects generally have challenges about coming in on budget and also being late as well. I think what makes nuclear more unique is that you have, first of all, public acceptance issues that can function then in the political life cycle of the project and government support. And what we see, in any of these structures, the importance of sustained government support over political cycles, over time, over the life of the project. Because if government support changes, that can then dramatically affect the economics. So I think that public aspect is very important. I think similarly, the role of the nuclear safety regulator is unique to the asset class. You don't have anything to that extreme when you look at other types of power projects. And so the safety function is so important in nuclear. It's a source of strength for nuclear, but the regulatory process in and of itself can be a source of delays. And also, if the regulations change, it can be, as we saw after 3 Mile Island, projects having to be redesigned, reconfigured, things being ripped out and rebuilt, which there's the time function, but also a cost function. And especially when you start going into countries that are doing it for the first time, you have not only that classic regulatory risk in nuclear, but you also have that regulatory uncertainty because now you have to get through the process and there's no track record. You don't know, is this going to take a year? Is it going to take 2 years? Is it going to take 3 years? Will they do something that's unprecedented? And so I think that aspect of it is also a challenge. There's another whole side of nuclear that makes it very different, and it has to do with the operating life of the asset. So with these new reactor designs, they're going to get licensed probably for 60 years, and with refurbishments and upgrades, they'll probably run for 80, if not 100 years, which is tremendous. But when you do financial modeling, after about 30 years, everything discounts to zero. So your model tells you one thing, but logically, we sit there and say, at year 30 and a day, I have an asset that may run for another 70 years, but that's not being reflected in my model. Similarly, things like energy security, energy diversity, clean power generation, none of these things, except in the case of clean power, unless there's a carbon tax or something, none of these things fit into your financial model. And so there's no value for energy security. There's no value for energy diversity. And so our financial models tend to fail us when we're making a decision, if it's done at a project level and at a corporate level, because our models are limited. Yet when we think of electricity and how fundamental it is to modern society and sort of the social contract between government and the people that, when you flip the light switch, the lights are supposed to go on. When you turn the spigot, clean water is supposed to come out. Nuclear has a certain quality that other types of power generation don't. And because of that, we don't capture all the benefits. And it gets sort of an unfair treatment by our financial models relative to other things. And then, of course, sort of the last bit to all of this is the functioning of our electricity markets, because when we built, there are 99 operating reactors in the United States. We built far more. They were all built in regulated markets. Now we've deregulated half of our markets. Nuclear struggles in those markets. We're not trying to build new ones in those markets. And it really, again, relates to that front-end investment, which there's a risky period, but it's a relatively short period as long as I can then recover that by fully dispatching my base load unit over the next 60 or 80 years. But if I lose that certainty, then my front end becomes even riskier.
Going back to the subject of nuclear newcomers and sort of the uncertainty of having to develop regulatory institutions from scratch, and there's certainly been expressions of interest by many countries in starting civil nuclear programs. How does financing impact project development, procurement decisions, and thus also the competitiveness of various countries with respect to civil nuclear exports?
I think what you're finding is you have a lot of people that want nuclear power, but they can't afford it. And so, originally it was just about the technology. Then it became about debt. Then it became about debt and equity. And so what you're seeing is these integrated offerings that are the technology, the project delivery, fuel supply, and then the financing. And it seems that right now what is driving decisions more than anything else is the financing. And so, when you look comparatively at the competitive landscape, when you have state-owned entities, they can do things that the ones that are not simply can't do. It doesn't mean that they don't behave in a commercial manner. It's just that they may be able to go to some places in terms of the interest rates they charge or the tenor of the loans or other conditions that set them apart from some of the other offerings. And when you then consider the scale of these projects, a slight difference in in the interest rate can have dramatic effects on the project, or the tenor of repayment. When you model that creates change. And so, especially when you're a country that's never done it before, if you have someone that's coming to you with a completely integrated offering, that becomes very attractive. Politics aside, politics can actually affect who you may want to deal with and not, but politics aside, that sort of one-stop shopping where I can do all of this for you and bring financing becomes very compelling for countries that may not have the financial capacity that others do, because they're looking at it and saying, I need the power, I need to make this transformative change, I need clean baseload energy, so I get to nuclear, but if I can't do it, someone's got to help me. And so the more help that is coming from a source, oftentimes it's once you determine that each of the technologies are good enough, then the cost and the financing become the drivers. And for those that maybe can be more aggressive on those points, that's going to help them develop those markets better.
You briefly mentioned the state-owned enterprises and the inherent advantages that they have in this space. Russian and Chinese nuclear vendors, both state-owned, vertically integrated, bring a lot of government money, government financing to the table, and so they're often perhaps unfairly lumped together in discussions about competition in the global nuclear market. In terms of nuclear exports, export financing, how are their approaches similar, and how do they differ?
Well, I think just in terms of timing, I think Rosatom is ahead of China. Rosatom's been out there doing it longer.
Sure.
They've entered into more relationships with a variety of countries. Yep. They've locked up certain markets. Sure. And so I think just from a deal formation phase, they've been more aggressive. I think China,
ahead of the game.
Yeah, and I think China has been a bit more inwardly focused to start.
Sure.
Yes, they are doing things in Pakistan, but I don't know that a lot of the world focuses on who's doing nuclear in Pakistan. Not to denigrate the Pakistanis, it's just not, when you think about trends in the market, people are going to take a lot from that experience. But I think you see the Chinese coming on stronger now. Mm-hmm. And when you look at what they did in the UK and what they were on the verge of doing in Argentina, they're using their ability to provide financing to then place their technology. So in the case of Hinkley Point, it was, well, we don't have enough we don't have enough sources of funds, so the Chinese will come in and save us. The Chinese come in and said, but then I want content, I want my own site. They kind of did the same thing in Argentina. And so they're looking at financing as a way to then place their new reactors and build relationships that way. It's a little more, I would say, financially or commercially driven than maybe the Russian offering. That's not to say that the Russians aren't being very sophisticated in the commercial aspects of what they're doing, because they see it as a business as well as a diplomatic initiative. But I think that what you have is you see a shift in the nuclear industry from what was dominated by, we'll call it the West and Japan, to now where are we seeing the most plants being built? China, India, Russia. Who are the exporters that are doing things of note? China, Russia, South Korea. So you see a shift in the industry and in the way that these deals are being formed because the traditional players have either changed their attitudes towards nuclear, their companies have undergone changes, whether it's what happened to Areva or Westinghouse now coming out of bankruptcy and being bought by Brookfield. So we see these changes, whereas I think when you look at Russia and China, it's part of national planning, state ownership, but it's very integrated and coordinated at the highest levels, whereas maybe not so much in other countries.
Well, let's contrast, let's say, the Chinese situation to what's going on here in the U.S. There's been a lot of press on the issues surrounding U.S. Exim Bank, but even if Exim were fully functioning, would that sufficiently level the playing field for U.S. exports?
I'll give you the lawyer's answer.
Okay.
It depends. And, I think you could see situations where that might be enough, depending on the amount of U.S. content and what sources the host country have to commit to the project. And they may value U.S. content and U.S. relationship. And so U.S. Exim bringing a significant amount of funding to the table could be determinative. But, even if you move away from China and you look at Japan, JBIC, their export credit agency, has something called the Overseas Investment Loan Program. Mm-hmm. And so what that enables them to do is loan money from JBIC to the major Japanese vendors who then can invest that as equity into a project. Okay. And so that equity side can become very important as well. And I think, what we need to rethink in the United States is how can we provide a more diverse set of tools. U.S. Exim, if they get quorum and can then start lending money again, which we all hope will happen soon, they can loan, which is very powerful. They can provide guarantees, which is very powerful. But the story on the equity side is missing. And I think when you look at a lot of these countries that want to do things, they're so desperate in trying to source money that being able for these ARC companies to provide equity into these deals would be helpful, because we're seeing that from the competition. We're seeing others do that, whether it's the Koreans putting equity into Baraka or, the Japanese Hitachi buying the Horizon project. So that equity side, that ownership side can become very important in how these projects go forward.
Okay. As you briefly mentioned earlier, you were involved in advising on financing for the Baraka nuclear project in the UAE, which drew upon financing from multiple sources, multiple governments, multiple ECAs. How would you assess Baraka as a potential model for more extensive multinational financing arrangements, partnerships with respect to nuclear export projects?
I think there's a couple things with the UAE. I mean, the first thing to recognize is the UAE was very committed to doing things to the highest international standards. That's very important for any financing. Second thing to recognize is not all countries are like the UAE in terms of their financial capacity. So, what the UAE was able to do in terms of bringing in talent and providing financing for the project, other countries may not be able to go there. Sure. But when you look at the debt side, what was interesting is under the original deal, you had both Korea Exim and US Exim that were going to provide significant amounts of financing, and then a commercial bank tranche. And I think the fact that you had a third flag in the deal, in this case it was the American flag, was very important, because you had an inherent sensitivity to the project being a nuclear project in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. I think the Emiratis were very aware that that was a sensitive issue, and they dealt with it head on. But by having the U.S. in the deal, now it wasn't just about two countries, it was about three. I think similarly, with the amount that the Koreans were initially committing, there were maybe some questions in Korea about the size of that. And when you're an export credit agency and your mission is to support exports, you could say, hey, I diligenced the project and everything looks good. And the cynic would say, well, of course you're going to say that. It's your job to support this project. But then if you can say, well, I think it's good, but so does Another sovereign institution, US Exim, it's building credibility for the deal for the Koreans, for the Emiratis, for a nuclear project in general, and getting that multinational support creates a great story on that sort of reputational risk aspect of it. The sourcing of financing from multiple sources maybe wasn't as important to the UAE, but could be very important to other countries that don't have the UAE's resources. So being able to, mix content across the entire delivery chain enables you to then source financing from a number of countries. You get that reputational support, but you're also getting the funding support because, frankly speaking, the Koreans couldn't have done the original UAE deal over and over again. There would have been a capacity issue after a while. But by then mixing the delivery options, you can then leverage the money that one country may have from its export credit bank across multiple deals by bringing in other partners.
Okay. Maybe looking a bit into the future, and you had said that you had done some work on small modular reactors, SMRs. There's clearly been a lot of buzz surrounding this new generation of reactors, which includes SMRs, but also non-light water reactors, you name it, fast reactors, high temperature, gas-cooled reactors. How do these new next generation technologies affect or change traditional assumptions about nuclear plant financing?
Well, on the negative side, and we'll get that one out of the way quickly, on the negative side, you have first-of-a-kind risk. So from a financing perspective, lenders don't like that.
Sure.
And so one of the challenges for all of these vendors is how can I do that first demonstration project, prove the technology works, that I can deliver it, build it, and operate it, so that I get past that. Once you get past that, then what you're really looking at is it's just not as large an amount of money. So because of that, you can start thinking about new ways to finance because you're not having to source so much. You're dealing with a smaller construction period window. So your interest during construction goes down as well. Now you're saving money. By the multiplicity of the deployment, you're getting into factory construction, a controlled environment where you're hopefully reducing construction risk. And so by getting into this replicability, this multiplicity, you start to, and that factory environment, you're hoping to reduce construction time, reduce construction risk, you have inherently lower costs. And then, one of the other things that you can do is by bringing more units on over time, you can start phasing your financing so the first operating reactors and the revenue generated can help to support the financing of future units. Moreover, you have situations in countries that either the grid is too small, so they don't need the large reactors, or they don't have the need or the capacity right now. So if I look at you and I say, I can sell you a 1,200 megawatt reactor, and you come back to me and say, I can't afford it and I don't need it today.
Yeah.
But I may need it 20 years from now or 30 years from now. So it's an all or nothing proposition. Whereas if you had, just make up a number, a 250 megawatt reactor, well, I need and can afford that today, and then 4 years from now I need more. And you can have the power generation class grow with your financing resources and your needs. So as the country's growing, nuclear can grow with you instead of buying something you can't afford and maybe don't need, or having to wait for years and years and not be able to do it.
One final question. What is the role of government in promoting nuclear power project development, and in particular, given all the challenges with financing nuclear power plants?
I think no matter the financing or project deployment structure you think of, regardless of whether it's the state-owned entities or the corporate entities, you see that government is essential to the success of these programs. Whether it's by policies and law versus supporting the financing, helping to de-risk the project. There's many roles for government to play. I think one of the keys is really this initial development period where you're talking 5 to 10 years prior to commercial operation, that is where the market is struggling with those risks. And that's where government can really come in and help to de-risk the project and then get out. You know, it
Yeah.
doesn't have to take that risk for the life of the project, but it can play a very effective role during this most challenging time. So it's sort of a temporary risk transfer, and then there's got to be an exit strategy and some upside benefit. But I think what part of it is just laying out very clearly to the public why we're doing this. Because if you can't clearly articulate why you want nuclear, it's going to be very hard to put in place any of the tools that you need. If the public support is there, the government support is there, we can solve the problems that are challenging us. But if you don't, if you do sort of this all of the above, or it's one of the things that we kind of like, it's sort of that classic, you know, in a ham and egg breakfast, are you the chicken or the pig? You know, the chicken is involved, the pig is committed. You know, and I think that's what you need from a government perspective is, you know, you look at, for example, the UK did a very good job of educating the public on why it wanted to get back into new nuclear build. And after Fukushima, when you looked at public support, it did take a little bit of a dip, but it came right back because it was very well articulated why the UK needed nuclear.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you make the case to the public as to all the reasons why, you can start to overcome some of these issues, and you can start to justify government commitments, whether it's policy or financial or legal. All those things are secondary to sort of the justification in the first place. And I think what you see right now is the countries that are able to make that decision at the highest levels, we need nuclear for these reasons, they're the ones that are going forward. Mm-hmm. And the ones that are maybe just leaving it for the market and corporate to sort out, those are the ones that are struggling. And so I think that's where government leadership, again, in a variety of forms, under a variety of different systems and structures, it's going to be determinative in all of these cases.
Okay. Paul, thanks so much again for joining me, and thanks so much for this very insightful discussion.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.